I am preaching about risks and how it is good to take risks. My spouse looked at me. You? She asked a little incredulously. You are not a risk taker. Okay, that's fair. If you ask around, you would hear from others about some of my better qualities, but thrill seeker would not be on that list. Risk taker is not the descriptor that comes to most people's minds when they think of me. I'm okay with that. I'm still going to preach about embracing risk this morning. I'm talking about risk in a slightly different way, but still authentic way this morning. I am never going to jump out of an airplane or go cliff diving or rock climbing without safety lines. That's not the sort of risk that I'm drawn to. But those are not the only kinds of risks that are out there in life. I will share this story to seal perhaps my non-risk-taking bona fides. While still in seminary, I was looking for a congregation in which to do my internship. One congregation in a Chicago suburb gave me an interview, but ended up not giving me the position. I later learned they felt I was too trepidatious, too fearful. I had shared with them my concerns about moving to the Chicago area. I'm not a city person. I had two young children, and we had no financial resources. I knew it would be a hard year. I shared this during the interview. They heard that as fearful on my part. I would interpret it as realistic and honest. A year later, I reapplied to that congregation and was given the internship slot. One of their questions during that interview a year later was, "What has changed since the last time you applied?" I had lived for a year in Chicago for my last academic year of study, and it was a very hard year. I had been right. One thing I learned is this: perhaps I should not have shared with them my concerns about living in a big city with a young, poor family. I would have appeared less trepidatious. I might have gotten the job that first time around, but here we are. And perhaps I did not learn this don't share your fears lesson because I just told all of you about this. Here's why I share this story, however. I was fearful. I did see moving to Chicago as a risk. I still did it. I was correct in my assessment of the risk. It was a very hard year. Just recently, I found a great story that explains the experience that I'd had those decades back. Two children are at a public pool. One child is helping their younger sibling learn to jump into the water, and the younger one kept hovering at the edge. "But I'm scared," she would cry. "I'm scared." Her older brother would cajole her and comfort her. "You'll be okay. I'm right here. You can do this. You don't need to be afraid." But nothing worked until an older lady in the pool swam by and said, "It's okay to be scared. Do it anyway. Do it scared." That proved to be helpful advice for that child. Instead of "don't be scared," do it scared. I moved to Chicago. I took the risk. I didn't fall in love with Chicago. I didn't overcome my discomfort of big cities. They're too crowded. They're too frenetic. They're too distanced from natures. I just don't like them. I would be trepidatious if faced with the situation again. But I did it. I did it scared. Shel Silverstein has a poem. I'll that is a cautionary version of this same thing. He writes, Browning was scared of drowning, so he never would swim or get into a boat or take a bath or cross a moat. He just sat day and night with his door locked tight and his windows nailed down, shaking in fear that a wave might appear, and he cried so many tears that they filled up the room and he drowned. The difference is not who is scared and who is not. The difference is about what do you do with your fear. I'm preaching about risks and how it is good to take risks. I will not lie and say I have no fears in my life or that I am a great risk taker. Instead, I will tell you about overcoming the fears we have. This is about taking risks and having courage. I'm not talking about the courage to jump out of an airplane, but the courage to live your life faithfully and openly. People talk about fear and faith being opposites. Fear will hold you back, faith will set you free. And that is certainly true, but it's more complicated than that. The spirit is diminished when we let our fear rule our actions. By living in a faithful manner, the situation doesn't make the fear go away. The fear is just outweighed. Learning to take good risks is an important part of life. Growing up, I had a very high level of skill at assessing risk. Knowing the risks is not the same as taking the risks, of course. Growing up in the chaos of the alcoholic household gave me a keen ability to see the risks, to understand the potential consequences. And as a child, I usually chose to not take the risks. As I matured into a young adult, I worked my way into learning how to jump in the water, even though I was afraid, to use that little swimming pool story metaphorically. As an adult, I began to ask not if it was risky, but if the risk was worth taking. One of the teachers that I have found to help me clarify this, to help me learn to jump in the water, if you will, has been Brené Brown. I want to share this clip of her in an interview in which she talks about vulnerability and the relationship between vulnerability and risk.
So I think the biggest myth about vulnerability is that it's weakness. I think a lot of people were raised to believe that. It was modeled, I think, certainly in our culture. We see that a lot, that to be vulnerable, to be open, to be exposed is to be weak. And the truth is, what I found in my research is that vulnerability is not weakness. In fact, I would argue that it's our greatest measure of courage. When we went out and asked people, what is vulnerability? We heard things like, vulnerability is the first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is starting my own company. Vulnerability is taking responsibility for something that went wrong at work. Vulnerability is sitting with my wife who has stage 3 breast cancer and making plans for our young kids. Vulnerability is taking my business public. The definition I use in my work of vulnerability is simply uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Vulnerability is about the willingness to show up and to be seen even when there are no guarantees. And it's interesting to me, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I gave a talk, it's probably a couple of years now, and it was being translated by people doing American Sign Language, and they came up before the talk started and they said, are there any words that you're going to use a lot in your talk that we should know about that or might be different? And I said, well, I use the word vulnerability a lot. And there were two of them, they kind of looked at each other and they said, oh, we do this for vulnerability. And I said, what does that mean? They said, it means weak in the knees. And I'm like, wow, that's not how I talk about vulnerability. And she said, well, there's only one other sign for vulnerability. And I said, what is it? And she said, And I said, oh, that's what I'm talking about. And so to me, vulnerability is our most accurate measure of courage. I mean, it's pretty powerful when I have 13,000 pieces of data collected over 12 years that I cannot find a single incident or story of courage that was not completely underpinned by vulnerability. I think the problem arises that there's so many little paradoxes with vulnerability, and one of them is that vulnerability is courage in you, but weakness in me. When I meet you, it's the first thing I look for in you, but it's the last thing I want to show you in me. And so I think to really put ourselves out there, knowing that if we do that enough, we're going to fail, I just don't think it gets more courageous than that.
Dr. Brown says vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. The risk in the middle there is the key piece. There is a cost to being true. There's a risk in reaching out, in wanting to be better. Brené Brown says we need to risk being vulnerable to live more fully. That's the risk that I'm talking about. She talked about the difference between the sign language of vulnerability rooted in weak in the knees versus opening yourself. There is little risk in being weak in the knees. The good stuff is found in the risk of opening up and reaching out. We have an old anonymous piece in our hymnal that's simply entitled "To Risk." It says to laugh is to risk appearing the fool, to weep is to risk appearing sentimental, to reach out for another is to risk exposing our true self, to place our ideas, our dreams before the crowd is to risk loss, to love is to risk not being loved in return, to hope is to risk despair, to try is to risk failure, to live is to risk dying. When we put it like this, I am a high-end risk taker. I have shaped my life around risking failure and despair, looking foolish and appearing sentimental, putting my ideas before the crowd. That's my thing. My ministry is brimming with this sort of risk taking, with laughter and weeping, hopes and failures, vulnerability and love. You too can live your life wrapped around vulnerability and love. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. C.S. Lewis warns us. If you want to keep it intact, he continues, you must give your heart to no one. You must, not even an animal, wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries, avoid all entanglements, lock it safe in a casket or a coffin of your selfishness, but in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable. So the question is not, is it a risk? The question is, which risks are worth taking? Which risks are you taking? Have you taken in your life? Which ones were worth it? What have you gained? What have you lost? There's always more risk. Will you risk associating with people on the margin? Will you risk being an ally? Will you risk telling people they are important to you? Will you risk telling a friend that their off-color jokes are offensive? Will you risk giving shelter to someone in need? Will you risk telling people that you are in need? Maybe you don't want to jaywalk or bungee jump off a high bridge. Maybe you are scared of heights or of large crowds or of public speaking. Maybe you are not comfortable getting the vaccine given your own immune issues, or you're unwilling to risk arrest at a protest. What's the line for you? What are the issues or situations that are on the edge in your heart? I encourage you to push yourself, but to ask which risks are worth taking. Poke at the edges. Just because you are afraid of something does not mean you need to overcome it. Most of the time, fear is a healthy warning, giving us useful information about ourselves and our world. But there are times when our fears get detached from reality, detached from what's really going on, and we get stuck in our fear. In such cases, it is worth the risk to push past that. The spirit will not abide being stuck. You cannot grow when you are stuck. And the good stuff is found in the risk of opening up and reaching out. So embrace risk. I say live, care, tell people that you care. Try again. Let yourself be vulnerable. Reach out and be loving. It's worth it. We will get hurt. We will fail. And we will surely sometimes lose. But that is not all that will happen because the risk is worth it. Follow your spirit to reach beyond your fear. All the good stuff is found in the risk of opening up and reaching out. In a world without end, may it be so.